Champagne flutes shattered against Italian marble, ringing out like church bells signaling a funeral. Silk and lace suffocated the grand hall. Guests froze, their silver forks hovering over plates of untouched veal. A bride stood at the head table, her knuckles white around a microphone, spitting venom at an old woman in a wheelchair. Nobody breathed. In that cavernous room, smelling of gardenias and impending ruin, a groom watched his new wife sign her own death warrant, realizing too late that rings do not tame monsters. Sweat pooled at the base of Sadie's spine, trapped beneath layers of Duchess satin and boning. The reception hall of the Oakhaven estate was stifling, heated by the collective body temperature of 300 guests and thousands of imported wax candles that smelled cloyingly of vanilla and burning wicks. She was 24, dripping in diamonds that felt heavy and cold against her collarbones, and completely drunk on the power of the day. Declan sat beside her. He was a man who commanded rooms without speaking, a presence built on quiet threats and generational wealth. Tonight, he wore a tailored tuxedo that smelled faintly of dry cleaning solvent and the cedar humidor where he kept his cigars. He was tracing the rim of his water glass, his attention divided between his new bride and the sprawling ecosystem of his associates, rivals and family seated before them. And then there was Miriam. Miriam sat at table 1, directly in Sadie's line of sight. Declan's mother did not wear the customary joy of a mother-in-law. She wore a high-necked, charcoal grey gown that made her look like a mourning widow. Her arthritic hands rested on the silver pommel of her cane, and her eyes, pale, milky, yet piercingly sharp, tracked Sadie's every movement. Miriam had never approved. She hadn't yelled or thrown fits. She had simply weaponized silence. A turned cheek here, a heavy sigh there, a quiet instruction to the caterers to change Sadie's menu choices. The resentments had piled up in Sadie's chest like dry kindling, and the 3 glasses of vintage Dom Perignon she had consumed on an empty stomach were the match. Sadie stood up. The chair scraped against the hardwood, a harsh, grating sound that cut through the low jazz playing in the corner. She grabbed her butter knife and tapped it against her crystal flute. Clink, clink, clink. The murmurs died down. Declan looked up, a faint, polite smile touching the corners of his mouth. He thought she was going to thank her bridesmaids. He thought she was going to say something sweet, something predictable. "I want to make a toast," Sadie said into the microphone. Feedback whined for a split second, vibrating in the teeth of the front row guests. She gripped the metal stand. It was cool and grounding. "To family. The ones we choose and the ones we are, unfortunately strapped to." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the back of the room. Declan's smile didn't drop, but the skin around his eyes tightened. The subtle shift in his posture was microscopic, a slight squaring of the shoulders, the ceasing of his finger tracing the glass. "Especially to my new mother-in-law, Miriam," Sadie continued, her voice echoing too loudly off the vaulted ceilings. She stepped out from behind the head table, dragging the microphone cord with her. The heavy satin of her skirt brushed against the floral arrangements, knocking a white rose to the floor. "Miriam, who has been nothing but instructive." Miriam did not blink. She just stared at Sadie, her face a map of deep, impassive wrinkles. "She taught me so much about this family," Sadie said, her tone dipping into a mock-sweet cadence that dripped with acid. "Like how appearances are everything. How it's vital to keep the silver polished, even if the hands polishing it are shaking from decades of looking the other way." The silence in the room became absolute. The jazz band stopped playing. The only sound was the hiss of the air conditioning vents and the heavy, rhythmic thud of Sadie's own heart in her ears. Adrenaline flooded her system. It tasted like pennies at the back of her throat. She told me last week that a woman's place in this world is to be a quiet harbor. Sadie laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. But look at her, the great matriarch, sitting there in a chair she hasn't left in 5 years because she's too fragile to stand on her own 2 feet, let alone run an empire. You're a relic, Miriam. You sit in your dusty rooms and you judge me for not knowing which fork to use. But the truth is, nobody cares about your forks anymore. They care about Declan, and Declan chose me, not your archaic rules. Me. Sadie threw her free hand out, gesturing to the crowd, expecting a gasp, expecting someone to validate her rebellion. She wanted to shatter the oppressive, suffocating grip this old woman had on the room. Instead, she felt a profound, terrifying vacuum drop over the hall. The guests weren't looking at her with shock. They were looking at the floor. The underbosses, the capos, the men who usually roared with laughter and slammed their fists on tables were staring rigidly at their plates. The air grew thick, heavy with an electric tension that made the fine hairs on Sadie's arms stand up. She looked at Miriam. The old woman hadn't moved a muscle, but a single, solitary tear of pure, unadulterated humiliation leaked from the corner of her milky eye, tracking slowly down the deep powder of her cheek. Miriam slowly lowered her head, staring at her lap, her arthritic fingers tightening around her cane until the joints cracked audibly in the quiet room. Sadie's triumph soured instantly in her stomach. A wave of nausea hit her. She turned to look at Declan. He was still seated. He hadn't lunged for the microphone. He hadn't shouted, but his face was completely devoid of color. The polite smile was gone, replaced by a slack, hollow expression. He looked at his mother's bowed head, and then he looked at Sadie. His eyes were dead. There was no rage in them. There was something much worse. It was the look of a man who had just opened his front door and found his house burned to the foundation. It was grief, and following the grief, a cold, mechanical recalibration. Declan stood up. He didn't rush. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket. The scrape of his chair sounded like a gunshot. He walked around the table, his leather shoes silent on the marble, and stopped in front of Sadie. He didn't look at her. He reached out, his fingers wrapping around the microphone stand. His knuckles brushed hers. His skin was freezing. "The bride," Declan said, his voice quiet, flat, carrying no amplification, but somehow reaching every corner of the room, "has had too much to drink. Excuse us." He didn't grab her arm. He didn't yank her. He simply turned and began walking toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall. He knew she would follow. The sheer gravity of his exit demanded it. Sadie dropped the microphone. It hit the floor with a deafening clunk, rolling under a table. She gathered fistfuls of her heavy skirt, the satin suddenly feeling like a lead apron. She hurried after him, her heels clicking frantically, a syncopated, desperate rhythm against his measured strides. "Declan," she hissed, as they pushed through the doors into the dimly lit, carpeted hallway leading to the estate's private offices. The smell of the reception, roasted meat, flowers, sweat, was instantly replaced by the scent of lemon polish, old paper, and dust. "Declan, wait." He didn't stop until he reached his father's old study. He pushed the door open, stepped inside, and left it ajar for her. Sadie slipped in, pushing the heavy door shut behind her. The click of the latch echoed in the cavernous room. The study was dark, illuminated only by a single brass reading lamp on a massive mahogany desk. The shadows stretched long and menacing against the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Declan was standing by the window, his back to her. He had unbuttoned his jacket and was aggressively tearing his bow tie from his collar. He threw the strip of black silk onto a leather armchair. It draped over the armrest like a dead snake. "You're mad," Sadie started, her voice defensive, high-pitched. The alcohol was still buzzing in her veins, making her reckless. "I know it was harsh, but she has been torturing me for months, Declan." The snide comments, the way she looks at me. I needed to establish a boundary. Declan braced both hands on the windowsill. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The sound was ragged, as if there was broken glass in his lungs. "A boundary," he repeated. The words lacked inflection. "Yes, I'm your wife now. She needs to know her place." Declan turned around. The dim light caught the planes of his face, emphasizing the sharp cut of his jaw and the deep, exhausted shadows beneath his eyes. He looked physically ill. The raw imperfection of his reaction threw Sadie off balance. She had expected him to yell. She had prepared for a screaming match. She was ready to cry, to apologize, to make up. But Declan just looked tired, monumentally, fundamentally exhausted. "Do you know," Declan began, his voice barely above a whisper, "what my mother did to get that wheelchair?" Sadie swallowed. Her throat was bone dry. She has a degenerative condition. She has a bullet lodged in her lower spine," Declan said flatly. "She took it 20 years ago. We were getting into a car in Palermo. A hitman from the Greco family fired a shotgun from an alleyway. She saw him before my father did. She shoved me down into the footwell and threw her body over mine. The buckshot tore through the door and shattered her L4 vertebra. She never walked again. She traded her legs for my life." The silence in the study was absolute. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Each sound felt like a hammer against Sadie's temples. The adrenaline vanished, leaving behind a cold, hollow terror. The edges of her vision blurred. "Declan, I didn't know." "No," Declan said, rubbing his hand over his face. He pressed his fingers into his eyes until the knuckles turned white. "You didn't know? Because you don't know anything, Sadie. You look at us, you look at this life, and you see a movie. You see cocktail parties and black cards, and you think you're playing a role. You think you're untouchable because you share my bed." "That's not true," she choked out, stepping forward. She reached for him. He didn't flinch away, but he didn't receive her either. Her hand landed on his chest. Through the crisp cotton of his shirt, she could feel his heart beating, slow, steady, completely calm. It was the calmness of a machine. It terrified her more than if he had struck her. "I loved you," Declan said. He used the past tense. It hung in the air, a physical weight. "I looked at you, and I saw someone separate from the filth I deal with every day. I thought you were light. I fought my mother to marry you. I fought my capos. I told them you were naive, but you had a good heart." He looked down at her hand on his chest, then slowly reached up and removed it by the wrist. His grip was loose, gentle even, but resolute. He let her arm drop to her side. "You aren't light, Sadie. You're just cruel, and you're stupid." He said the word stupid with a quiet devastation. "You stood in front of 300 people, people who would slit my throat if they thought I was weak, and you humiliated the woman who built this family. You mocked her physical frailty. You made me look like a man who cannot control his own house. I was drunk. I was angry. Please, Declan, let me go back out there. I'll apologize. I'll get on my knees." "It's too late," he said, turning away from her again. He walked to the desk and poured an inch of amber liquid from a crystal decanter into a tumbler. He didn't offer her any. He didn't drink it himself. He just stared at the liquid sloshing against the glass. Respect is currency, Sadie. Once it's burned, you can't tape the ashes back together. So what happens now? Sadie whispered, her voice trembling. The heavy satin of her dress suddenly felt like a burial shroud. Declan set the glass down. He looked at her, his eyes devoid of anything resembling warmth, affection, or even anger. He looked at her the way he looked at a bad spreadsheet, a failed investment. "You wanted to be the lady of the house," Declan said softly. "Congratulations. The house is yours." He walked past her, his shoulder brushing against hers. He opened the heavy oak door and stepped out into the hallway. "Declan!" she called out, spinning around. He stopped in the doorway, not looking back. "Don't come back to the reception. Go to the bridal suite. Wait there." He closed the door, leaving her alone in the dark, the scent of lemon polish and impending ruin settling over her shoulders. The bridal suite of the Oakhaven estate was located in the east wing, far removed from the noise of the main house. It was a cavernous room, decorated in pale blues and cream, featuring a massive four-poster bed draped in sheer netting. A bottle of champagne sat in a silver bucket next to a plate of chocolate-covered strawberries. The ice had long since melted into a tepid puddle. Sadie sat on the edge of the mattress. The mattress was too soft. It offered no support. She felt like she was sinking. It was 3:00 a.m. The reception had ended hours ago. She had listened to the muffled sounds of cars driving down the long gravel driveway. The crunching of tires on stone had sounded like teeth breaking. She had waited for the doorknob to turn. She had practiced her apology 100 times, rehearsing the exact inflection of her tears, the exact angle of her bowed head. But the doorknob never turned. Her ribs ached. The corset of her dress felt like an iron cage, shrinking with every breath she took. She couldn't take it off by herself. It required someone to undo the 32 silk-covered buttons down the back. At 3:30 a.m., she couldn't breathe anymore. The physical pain was compounding the creeping dread in her stomach. She stood up, her bare feet sinking into the thick Persian rug, and walked to the door. She opened it a crack and peered into the hallway. The corridor was dimly lit by sconces mimicking candlelight. It was dead quiet. "Hello," she called out, her voice raspy. No answer. She opened the door wider and stepped out. The draft from the old stone walls hit her bare shoulders, raising goosebumps. She walked down the hallway toward the servants' stairs. "Maria?" Sadie called out the name of the head housekeeper. "Elena, is anyone there?" She reached the top of the stairs and looked down into the kitchen. The fluorescent lights were buzzing softly. A figure was standing by the industrial sink, wiping down the stainless steel counter. It was one of the maids, a young girl whose name Sadie couldn't remember. "Excuse me," Sadie said, relief flooding her chest. She hurried down the stairs, lifting her heavy skirt. "I'm so sorry to bother you. I know it's late, but I can't reach the buttons on my dress. Could you please help me?" The maid stopped wiping the counter. She did not look up. She kept her eyes fixed on the metal surface. "Please?" Sadie asked, stepping closer. "It will only take a second. I can't breathe." The maid slowly folded her rag. She placed it neatly beside the sink. Then, without ever making eye contact with Sadie, she turned on her heel and walked out the back door of the kitchen, disappearing into the dark corridor that led to the staff quarters. Sadie stood frozen under the harsh fluorescent lights. The hum of the refrigerator sounded like a jet engine. She was invisible. The realization washed over her, cold and absolute. It wasn't just Declan. The order had come down. She was not to be touched. She was not to be acknowledged. She was a ghost, haunting a house she didn't own. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in the back of her mouth. She backed out of the kitchen, her breath coming in short, erratic gasps. She ran up the stairs, tripping over the hem of her satin gown, tearing the delicate Chantilly lace. She didn't care. She ran down the hallway, bursting through the doors of the East Wing. She headed for Declan's private quarters in the West Wing. She reached the heavy mahogany doors that led to his suite. They were guarded. Rhys, Declan's second-in-command, was leaning against the wall. He was a large man, built like a brick wall, wearing a rumpled suit. He was smoking a cigarette, the ember glowing an angry orange in the dim light, the smell of cheap tobacco mixed with the expensive cedar of the hallway paneling. As Sadie approached, Rhys didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just took a slow drag of his cigarette and exhaled the smoke through his nose. "Let me in, Rhys," Sadie demanded. Her voice shook, ruining any attempt at authority. Rhys looked at her. His eyes lazily scanned her disheveled hair, the torn lace of her skirt, her bare, dirty feet. There was no pity in his expression. There wasn't even disdain. There was just nothing. It was the look you give a stray dog that has wandered too close to your porch. "The boss is sleeping," Rhys said. His voice was gravelly, low. "I am his wife," Sadie said, forcing her spine straight, trying to summon the arrogance she had wielded so easily just hours before. "Move." She took a step forward, reaching for the brass handle. Rhys didn't push her. He simply shifted his weight, putting his massive frame between her hand and the door. He didn't look at her. He looked at the wall opposite them. "Go back to your room, Mrs. Gallagher," Rhys said. The title sounded like a curse word in his mouth. "I need to talk to him. I can't get out of this dress. Please, Rhys." The arrogance cracked, replaced by a pathetic, whining edge. She hated herself for it, but she was suffocating. Rhys finally looked down at her. He took one last drag of his cigarette, dropped it onto the pristine wool carpet, and crushed it beneath his leather shoe, leaving a black smear of ash. "You made your bed in front of everyone tonight," Rhys said quietly. "Now you have to lie in it, even if you can't take your shoes off." He didn't say another word. He just stood there, an immovable mountain of muscle and loyalty to a man who had entirely written her off. Sadie backed away, her vision blurred with hot, angry tears. She turned and walked back the way she came. The walk back to the East Wing took an eternity. The hallway felt like a tunnel, narrowing with every step. When she reached the bridal suite, she locked the door behind her. She walked into the massive, marble-tiled bathroom. The fluorescent lights overhead were unforgiving. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her mascara had flaked, leaving dark smudges under her eyes. Her hair, which had taken 3 hours to style, was falling flat. And the dress, the beautiful, custom-made, $20,000 dress that she had used as a shield, now functioned as a straitjacket. She reached behind her back, her fingers scrabbling desperately at the tiny silk buttons. She managed to undo the top 3, her joints popping with the unnatural angle, but the rest were out of reach, fastened tightly against the curve of her spine. She pulled, she twisted. She grabbed the fabric at her waist and yanked upward, trying to shimmy it over her head. The boning dug viciously into her ribs, scraping her skin raw. She let out a frustrated sob, her hands dropping to her sides. She couldn't get it off. Sadie collapsed onto the cold marble floor of the bathroom. The chill of the stone seeped into her bones. She pulled her knees to her chest as best as the rigid corset would allow. She laid her cheek against the tiles, staring at the grout lines. Outside, the sky began to turn a bruised, purplish grey. Dawn was breaking over the Oakhaven estate. The birds began to chirp, a cheerful, mocking sound that filtered through the thick glass windows. Sadie closed her eyes, the smell of her own stale sweat and wilting gardenias filling her nose. She was the lady of the house. and she was completely, utterly alone. The payment hadn't come in the form of violence, or shouting, or a dramatic exit. It came in the form of silence, a silence so profound, so absolute, it threatened to crush her lungs more effectively than the satin cage around her ribs. This was day one. Morning arrived, not with a gentle awakening, but with a sharp, agonizing cramp in Sadie's left side. She opened her eyes to the glare of midday sun slicing through the bathroom skylight, directly onto the cold marble tiles. Her neck was entirely stiff. Dried tears formed an itchy, tight film over her cheeks, smelling faintly of the expensive, metallic setting spray the makeup artist had used 24 hours ago. She pushed herself up into a sitting position. Her lungs immediately protested. The corset, the $20,000 wedding gown, was now a wrinkled, dirty mess. The hem was stained grey from dragging across the floors, and the pristine white Duchess satin was creased beyond repair. Panic, dull and throbbing, settled behind her eyes. She needed to breathe. Her ribs felt bruised, tender to the touch even through the thick fabric. Sadie scrambled to her feet, her bare soles slipping slightly on the smooth stone. She stumbled out of the bathroom and into the bridal suite, her eyes scanning the room. There was a heavy oak writing desk in the corner. She pulled the drawers open, her movements frantic, the wood scraping loudly in the quiet room. Hotel stationery, a leather-bound folder, a Mont Blanc pen. In the bottom drawer she found them, a pair of heavy, iron tailoring shears, left behind by the seamstress during her final fitting. Sadie grabbed the heavy metal scissors. They were cold and awkward in her trembling hands. She backed up to the full-length mirror, twisting her torso until her spine screamed. She slid the bottom blade of the shears under the tightest part of the satin bodice, resting the cold metal against her bare skin. She squeezed the handles. The thick fabric resisted for a moment before giving way with a loud, violent "Reap!" The sound was deeply satisfying. Sadie gasped, taking her first full breath in nearly 20 hours. She cut higher, hacking at the intricate silk-covered buttons and the delicate French lace. She didn't care about the cost. She didn't care about the craftsmanship. She just wanted the cage off. With a final, desperate tug, she pulled the ruined bodice apart. The heavy dress slid off her shoulders and collapsed into a lifeless puddle of white fabric around her ankles. Sadie stood in front of the mirror in just her silk underwear. Her torso was a map of angry, deep red welts, where the boning had dug into her flesh. She traced a particularly nasty bruise on her ribcage. It throbbed beneath her fingertips. She looked at her reflection. Her hair was a matted bird's nest. Her eyes were bloodshot. She didn't look like a mafia bride. She looked like a survivor pulled from a car wreck. She kicked the ruined dress into the corner of the room. It looked like a dead swan. She went to her unpacked suitcases and pulled out an oversized grey cashmere sweater and a pair of worn denim jeans. The soft wool felt like heaven against her abused skin. She tied her hair back into a tight, messy knot at the nape of her neck. It was time to face the house. The estate was alive with the mundane hum of daytime operations. As Sadie walked down the wide, carpeted stairs toward the main floor, she heard the low rumble of a vacuum cleaner in the west wing and smelled the rich, dark aroma of espresso roasting in the kitchen. She walked into the dining room. The massive oak table, which usually seated 20, was bare except for a small, linen placemat at the far end. Miriam sat there. She was in her wheelchair, dressed in a crisp beige blouse, reading the Financial Times. A cup of black tea steamed gently beside her right hand. The only sound in the room was the crisp rustle of the newspaper pages turning. Sadie stopped in the doorway. Her stomach knotted. The instinct to turn around and run back to her room was overpowering, but her throat was parched, and her pride, though battered, was not entirely dead. She forced her feet to move. Her bare heels made soft thuds against the hardwood floor. She walked to the silver coffee urn on the sideboard. She picked up a porcelain cup and poured the dark liquid. Her hands were shaking. The cup rattled against the saucer, a sharp, nervous sound. Miriam didn't look up. Sadie walked to the table and pulled out a chair directly across from her mother-in-law. The wood scraped loudly. She sat down and wrapped her hands around the hot porcelain, seeking the warmth. "Good morning," Sadie said. Her voice cracked. It sounded small. Miriam turned a page of the newspaper. She lifted her teacup, took a slow, measured sip, and placed it back on the saucer with a quiet clink. "I said, 'Good morning,'" Sadie repeated, a defensive edge creeping into her tone. Miriam folded the newspaper with agonizing slowness. She placed it on the table. She looked past Sadie, fixing her milky eyes on the grandfather clock standing in the hallway. "Arthur," Miriam called out. Her voice was raspy, carrying the weight of decades of authority. A large man in a dark suit stepped into the doorway immediately. He kept his hands folded neatly in front of him. "Yes, Mum. The draft in here is terrible," Miriam said, her tone utterly flat. "Please close the doors to the terrace." "They are closed, Mum," Arthur replied softly. "Then it must be an open window," Miriam said, picking up her tea again. "Find the source of the draft and eliminate it. It's making the room entirely unpleasant." "Right away." Arthur bowed his head and left. Sadie's jaw tightened. She stared at the old woman, her pulse beating erratically in her neck. "You're just going to pretend I'm not here? Is that the game? The silent treatment?" Miriam picked up her newspaper again. "I am your son's wife," Sadie snapped, slamming her hand flat on the table. The coffee in her cup sloshed over the rim, burning her knuckles. She hissed and jerked her hand back, wiping the hot liquid on her jeans. Miriam did not flinch at the sound of the slam. She simply kept reading the stock market indexes. Sadie stood up, the chair nearly tipping backward. Her chest heaved. The utter lack of reaction was infuriating. It was worse than being yelled at. It was worse than being threatened. It was a complete erasure of her existence. She turned and marched out of the dining room, nearly colliding with a maid carrying a basket of fresh linens. "Watch it," Sadie spat. The maid stepped aside, kept her eyes glued to the baseboards, and hurried past without a word of apology. By day 4, the physical reality of her isolation began to set in. Sadie was a prisoner in a gilded cage. She had access to the sprawling gardens, the massive library, and the indoor pool. She could eat whatever the chef prepared, though her meals were always served to her alone, in the small breakfast nook off the kitchen, long after the rest of the family had eaten. She decided she needed to leave. Just for a few hours. Just to see faces that didn't treat her like dead air. She walked down the long gravel driveway toward the main gates. The sun was hot, baking the smell of pine needles into the air. When she reached the massive wrought-iron gates, they were closed. 2 armed guards stood by the security booth. "Open the gate," Sadie said to the closer guard, a young man with a thick neck and a sunburn. He didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead at the tree line across the road. "I need to go into town. Call a car," Sadie demanded, crossing her arms. Nothing. The man didn't even blink. Sadie walked up to the heavy iron bars and grabbed them, shaking them with all her might. They didn't budge a millimeter. The metal was hot against her palms. "Hey, I'm talking to you! Open this gate!" The second guard picked up a walkie-talkie attached to his belt. "We have a perimeter nuisance at the main gate. Send a cart." 5 minutes later, an electric golf cart whirred down the driveway. Reese was driving. He pulled up to the gates, put the cart in park, and looked at Sadie. He smelled of cheap mints and stale coffee. "Get in," Reese said. "I want to go into the city," Sadie said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and burgeoning panic. "I am not a hostage, Reese. I know the law." Reese let out a short, humorless exhale. "The law? That's funny." He leaned over and pushed open the passenger side door of the cart. "Get in the cart, Mrs. Gallagher." "Or what?" Sadie challenged, her chin jutting out. Reese looked at her, his eyes dead and unblinking. "Or I drag you by your hair back to the house. The boss said you don't leave the property. He didn't specify how you remain on it." The cold, matter-of-fact way he threatened her drained the blood from Sadie's face. She looked at the two guards. They were staring straight ahead, completely unbothered by the threat of violence. She realized, with a sickening drop in her stomach, that Reese wasn't bluffing. There were no cameras here. There were no neighbors. She climbed into the cart. The vinyl seat burned her thighs. Reese drove her back to the main house in silence. He stopped by the front steps. "Go inside. Stay inside." She walked into the grand foyer. It felt like a mausoleum. She pulled her cell phone out of her pocket. No service. It had been displaying no service since she woke up on the first morning. They had blocked her MAC address from the house Wi-Fi and jammed the cellular signal on the property. She walked into the library and booted up the desktop computer. She tried to log into her bank account to buy a plane ticket. Access denied. Account frozen. She tried her credit cards. Declined. She sat back in the leather chair, staring at the glowing monitor. The cursor blinked, mocking her. She had millions of dollars to her name in marital assets, and she couldn't afford a park of gum. She had the title of a boss's wife, and she had less power than the scullery maid. That evening, Declan came home. Sadie heard the heavy front door open and close. She heard the low murmur of voices in the hallway. Declan and Reese. She hurried out of the library and stood at the top of the main staircase, looking down into the foyer. Declan was taking off his tailored wool coat. He looked exhausted. His tie was loosened and his hair was windblown. He smelled of rain and jet fuel. "Declan," Sadie called down. Her voice echoed in the cavernous space. He didn't look up. He handed his coat to a waiting servant. "Have the Palermo files sent to my study," he said to Reese, "and pour me a drink. I need to review the shipping manifests tonight." "Declan, please!" Sadie practically ran down the carpeted stairs, nearly tripping over her own feet. She stopped at the bottom, just a few feet away from him. "Please, just look at me." He walked right past her. He didn't alter his stride. He didn't flinch. His shoulder brushed against hers, a fleeting, cold contact, but his eyes never left the hallway leading to his office. Sadie spun around and grabbed his arm. "Don't you ignore me!" she screamed, her voice cracking, ugly and shrill. "You can't just lock me up in this house and pretend I'm dead." Declan stopped. He looked down at her hand, gripping his forearm. His expression was a terrifying blank canvas. Slowly, he lifted his eyes to meet hers. There was no anger. There was no hatred. There was a chilling, absolute void. "Reese," Declan said, his voice quiet, even. Reese stepped forward immediately, grabbing Sadie's wrist with crushing force. He twisted it just enough to send a sharp spike of pain shooting up her arm, forcing her to release her grip on Declan. "Don't touch him again," Reese murmured in her ear, pulling her back. Declan adjusted his cuff where she had grabbed him, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles. He looked at her one last time, a look of mild distaste, as if she were a piece of mud tracked onto his clean floors. Then he turned and walked into his study, the heavy oak doors closing behind him with a definitive, echoing thud. A month passed. The days bled into one another, distinguished only by the shifting light through the massive estate windows. Sadie began to unravel. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She found herself talking to the walls just to hear a voice. She stopped wearing makeup. She stopped brushing her hair. She wandered the halls in oversized sweaters and socks, a ghost haunting her own life. She learned the routines of the house perfectly, simply because she had nothing else to do. She knew that the baker arrived at 4 a.m. She knew that Miriam did her physical therapy in the sunroom at 10 a.m. every Tuesday and Thursday. It was a Tuesday. Sadie was walking past the sunroom when she heard a sound that made her freeze. It was a sharp, involuntary gasp of pain. She pushed the door open slightly and peeked inside. The sunroom was flooded with bright, harsh daylight. The smell of medicinal rubbing alcohol and sharp eucalyptus filled the air. Miriam was out of her wheelchair, sitting on the edge of a padded physical therapy table. A burly physical therapist was manipulating Miriam's legs, pushing her knees toward her chest. Miriam's face was grey with agony. Her eyes were squeezed shut, and her jaw was locked so tight the tendons in her neck stood out like cords. She gripped the edges of the table until her knuckles turned translucent. "Breathe, Mrs. Gallagher," the therapist said softly, pushing the leg an inch further. Miriam let out another hiss of pain, a guttural, wet sound that sounded like tearing meat. Sadie watched, her stomach churning. The reality of the bullet, the buckshot that had shattered a spine to save a son, was no longer just an abstract story Declan had told her in the dark. It was right in front of her, raw and violent and present. The therapist finished the set and stepped back to write notes on a clipboard. Miriam slumped forward, panting heavily, sweat beading on her forehead. She looked small, frail. Without thinking, Sadie pushed the door open and stepped into the room. She walked to a small side table, picked up a towel and approached her mother-in-law. The therapist looked up, surprised, but said nothing. Sadie reached out, offering the towel to Miriam. Miriam opened her eyes. They locked onto Sadie. The sheer, concentrated venom in the old woman's gaze made Sadie physically recoil. It wasn't the blank apathy Declan showed her. It was pure, burning hatred. Before Sadie could react, Miriam's hand shot out. Her arthritic fingers, swollen and twisted, possessed terrifying strength. She slapped the towel out of Sadie's hand. It hit the floor with a soft thud. "Don't," Miriam croaked. Her voice was unused, sounding like sandpaper grinding against stone. "Don't you ever dare touch me." Sadie stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I was just trying to help." Miriam grabbed the armrests of the therapy table, dragging her useless lower half backward until she was sitting upright. She glared at Sadie, her chest heaving. "You think a towel erases what you are?" Miriam spat. The words were quiet, but they carried across the room like gunshots. "You stood in front of our people and declared yourself the master of a house you didn't build. You mocked the blood spilled to keep these walls standing." "I was drunk," Sadie whispered, a pathetic, broken excuse falling from her lips for the 100th time. "I was angry because you hated me from the day we met." Miriam let out a harsh, barking laugh that dissolved into a cough. "Hated you? You flatter yourself, girl. I didn't hate you. I saw you for what you were, a liability, a weak link." Miriam leaned forward, her milky eyes flashing. "In this world, women are either steel or they are glass. Steel holds the house up when the men fall. Steel takes the bullet. Glass just shatters and cuts everyone around it. You proved to every man in that room that you are glass. You made Declan look like a fool for choosing you." "I love him," Sadie choked out, tears finally spilling over her lashes, hot and humiliating. "Love?" Miriam sneered, rolling the word around in her mouth like a bad taste. "Love is for civilians. Love doesn't stop a bullet. Respect does. Fear does. You stripped him of both on his wedding night." Miriam gestured to the therapist. "Put me in the chair." The burly man quickly stepped forward, lifting Miriam with practiced ease and setting her gently into the wheelchair. He adjusted her footrests. Miriam grabbed the wheels and turned to face Sadie one last time. "You wanted to know your place, Sadie?" Miriam asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that chilled the room. "Look around. You are dead. You just haven't stopped breathing yet. And you will spend the rest of your life in this house, haunting the hallways, serving as a walking reminder to my son of his one solitary mistake." Miriam rolled her chair past Sadie, the rubber wheels squeaking faintly against the tile floor. The therapist followed, leaving Sadie alone in the sunroom. The heavy smell of eucalyptus lingered in the air. Sadie looked down at the towel lying on the floor. She slowly sank to her knees, the rough cotton of her sweatpants scraping against the tile. She picked up the towel and held it to her chest, curling into a tight ball on the floor. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the tears wouldn't stop. They soaked into the terry cloth, hot and useless. Miriam was right. The worst punishment wasn't violence. The worst punishment was being forced to live in the wreckage you created, entirely alone, forever. Autumn stripped the oak trees bare, turning the sprawling estate into a skeletal fortress. The oppressive heat of the summer faded, replaced by drafts that whistled through the ancient stone corridors. Sadie stopped trying to escape. She stopped begging Reese for a phone. She stopped waiting at the bottom of the stairs for a man who looked right through her. She became part of the furniture. Her days were spent in the massive, dust-moated library, sitting in a leather wingback chair that smelled of old pipe tobacco. She watched. With nothing else to do, Sadie finally began to study the machinery of the family she had so publicly mocked. Through cracked doors and overheard murmurs from the security detail, she learned the rhythm of a house built on violence. It wasn't glamorous. It was a suffocating, paranoid grind. She saw Reese fall asleep standing up in the foyer, dark purple bags under his eyes. She watched Capos arrive in the dead of night, smelling of copper and cheap whiskey, tracking mud onto the Persian rugs before disappearing into Declan's study. She noticed how Miriam never sat with her back to a window. The cocktail parties and black cards were a facade, a thin sheet of silk thrown over a wood chipper. Sadie had married the silk, completely ignorant of the blades beneath. It happened on a Tuesday in November. The rain was relentless, drumming a chaotic beat against the slate roof. Sadie was in her suite, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, staring at the muted television. At 11:14 p.m., the power died. The television snapped off, plunging the room into absolute darkness. The subtle, constant hum of the estate's massive HVAC system ceased. In the sudden ringing silence, a new sound emerged. Pop, pop, pop. It sounded like dry branches snapping underfoot. But Sadie had lived in this house long enough to know it wasn't wood. It was suppressed gunfire. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. Her stomach dropped, entirely bypassing fear and landing straight into a primal animal panic. She threw off the blanket and scrambled off the bed. Her bare feet hit the icy hardwood. A heavy, booming explosion shook the floorboards. Dust rained down from the plaster ceiling, coating her tongue with the taste of chalk. Shouting erupted from the west wing. Declan's wing. Men were screaming in Italian. The unmistakable, deafening roar of a shotgun echoed down the main corridor. They were under attack. Sadie's first instinct was to hide. She backed into her massive walk-in closet, pulling the heavy cedar door shut behind her. She crouched among her rows of untouched designer dresses, pulling her knees to her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her palms against her ears. Glass. You are glass. Miriam's gravelly voice played in her head, loud and mocking over the sound of shattering porcelain downstairs. "Glass just shatters and cuts everyone around it," Sadie sobbed, a pathetic wet sound in the dark closet. She was glass. She wanted to stay in the dark. She wanted Declan's men to handle it. She wanted to be a civilian again. Then she heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the stairs leading to the east wing. Her wing. But not just her wing. The east wing housed the guest suites, the bridal suite, and on the ground floor, directly below Sadie, Miriam's quarters. The matriarch was moved there to avoid the stairs. Sadie opened her eyes. The closet was pitch black, smelling of lavender sachets and expensive leather. If the intruders were pushing into the east wing, Rhys and Declan were likely pinned down in the west. Miriam was entirely alone, trapped in a wheelchair, with heavily armed men closing in. Steel holds the house up when the men fall. Sadie's hands shook so violently she could barely feel her own fingers. She crawled out of the closet. The bedroom was faintly illuminated by the ambient glow of the security floodlights outside, which had switched to the backup generator. She needed a weapon. She looked at the heavy oak desk, the bottom drawer. She pulled it open. The heavy iron tailoring shears rested exactly where she had thrown them months ago after cutting herself out of her wedding dress. She wrapped her right hand around the cold, unforgiving metal grips. They weighed almost 3 pounds. Sadie crept to the bedroom door and eased it open. The hallway smelled strongly of cordite and burning carpet. Downstairs, the shouting grew louder. She slipped into the corridor, pressing her back against the damask wallpaper. She didn't feel heroic. She felt nauseous. Her bladder ached with the urge to empty itself. Every breath was a ragged, shallow gasp that tasted of sulfur. She reached the top of the east wing staircase and looked down. 2 men in dark tactical gear were moving down the ground floor hallway. They moved with terrifying efficiency, sweeping their rifles across the doorways. One of them kicked the door to the library open, clearing it. The other moved toward the double doors of Miriam's suite. Sadie descended the stairs. She didn't plan her steps. She just moved, driven by a chaotic cocktail of terror and a desperate, clawing need to prove she was not entirely useless. The second man raised his boot and kicked the lock on Miriam's door. The wood splintered with a loud crack, the doors swinging inward. "Target secured," the man grunted into a shoulder radio, stepping into the room. Sadie reached the bottom landing. She gripped the shears so tightly, her fingernails dug painfully into her own palms. She ran toward the open doorway. Her bare feet made no sound on the thick wool runner. She peered around the shattered doorframe. The room was dimly lit by a bedside lamp. Miriam was out of her chair, dragged onto the floor by her hair. The intruder had his knee pressed firmly into the old woman's spine, pinning her to the rug. He was reaching for a heavy combat knife strapped to his thigh. Miriam wasn't screaming. She was staring straight ahead, her face a mask of furious, silent defiance. She locked eyes with Sadie in the doorway. Miriam didn't shake her head. She didn't ask for help. Her milky eyes simply widened by a fraction of a millimeter. Sadie stepped into the room. The intruder heard the floorboard creak. He began to turn his head, bringing his rifle around. Sadie didn't swing gracefully. She lunged forward, throwing her entire body weight behind her right arm, driving the heavy iron shears downward in a clumsy, brutal arc. The heavy metal blades struck the man in the side of the neck, right where the tactical vest met his collar. It didn't sound like it did in movies. There was no clean slice. There was a sickening, wet crunch of tearing cartilage and snapping bone. The shears sank deep, lodging firmly in the meat of his shoulder and neck. The man let out a wet, gargling shriek. He dropped his rifle and threw his hands up to his neck, his knee slipping off Miriam's back. Blood, hot, impossibly bright and reeking of copper, sprayed out in a rhythmic pulse, splattering across Sadie's face and chest. It was shockingly warm. Sadie fell backward, landing hard on her tailbone. The iron shears were ripped from her grip, remaining embedded in the man's neck. He staggered to his feet, thrashing wildly, his hand slipping on his own blood as he tried to pull the weapon free. He turned towards Sadie, taking one agonizing step forward. His eyes were wide, panicked, and dying. Sadie scrambled backward on her hands and feet, slipping on the slick carpet. She opened her mouth to scream, but only a dry rasp came out. Before the man could take another step, a deafening crack shattered the air in the room. The side of the intruder's head caved in. He dropped instantly, collapsing onto the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. His body hit the ground with a heavy, meaty thud. Sadie flinched, covering her ears. She looked up toward the doorway. Declan stood there. His white button-down shirt was torn and soaked in dark blood. Someone else's. His face was smeared with soot. He held a smoking 9mm pistol in his right hand. Reese was right behind him, sweeping an assault rifle down the hallway, breathing heavily. The silence that followed was absolute, save for the horrifying, gurgling sound of the dying man on the floor. Declan lowered his weapon. He looked at his mother on the floor. Then his eyes moved to Sadie. She was sitting in a puddle of blood. Her hands, her face, her oversized grey sweater. Everything was painted in a thick, metallic crimson. She was shaking so violently, her teeth were chattering, a rapid, clicking sound in the quiet room. Declan stepped over the dead man. He didn't offer Sadie his hand. He walked straight to his mother. He hooked his arms under Miriam's armpits and hoisted her up, placing her gently back into her wheelchair. "Are you hit?" Declan asked his mother. His voice was completely flat, entirely devoid of the adrenaline that was currently tearing Sadie's nervous system apart. Miriam straightened her beige blouse with trembling, blood-stained fingers. She cleared her throat, a harsh, rattling sound. "No," Miriam rasped. She looked down at the dead man on her carpet, then shifted her gaze to Sadie, who was still paralyzed on the floor. Miriam stared at her for a long, heavy moment. The disgust was gone. The hatred was gone. In its place was a cold, clinical reassessment. "The girl," Miriam said, her voice steadying. "She held the room." Declan turned to look at Sadie again. The blank, empty void he usually reserved for her was fractured. He looked at the heavy iron shears embedded in the dead man's neck, and then he looked at Sadie's blood-soaked hands. "Reese," Declan ordered, not taking his eyes off his wife. "Secure the perimeter. Call the cleaners." "Yes, boss," Reese grunted, stepping out of the room. Declan walked over to Sadie. He didn't crouch down. He just looked down at her. "Get up," he said. It wasn't a gentle request. It was an instruction. Sadie pushed herself up. Her legs felt like wet sand. She swayed, nearly losing her balance, but she locked her knees. She didn't wipe the blood from her face. She looked at him, her chest heaving, the metallic smell of death filling her lungs. "Go to my bathroom," Declan said, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "Wash it off. Do not use the guest towels." He turned his back on her and began speaking rapidly to Miriam in hushed, urgent tones about securing the compound. Sadie stood there for a second. There was no embrace. There was no thank you. There was no tearful reconciliation. But he had told her to go to his bathroom. He had spoken to her. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving a trail of bloody footprints on the hardwood floor. The water in Declan's massive walk-in shower ran pink for 20 minutes. Sadie sat on the tiled floor under the scalding spray, scrubbing her skin raw with a rough loofah. The smell of copper was permanently etched into her sinuses. She felt hollowed out, as if the girl who had proudly gripped a microphone at her wedding reception had been surgically removed, leaving only a tired, cynical shell behind. She turned the water off and wrapped herself in a thick, black towel. She stepped out into the bedroom. Declan was sitting on the edge of the mattress. He had stripped off his ruined shirt and was pressing a piece of gauze against a shallow laceration on his bicep. He looked up when she entered. The estate was quiet again. The cleaners had arrived. The faint, sterile scent of industrial bleach wafted up through the air vents, masking the gunpowder. Sadie stood by the bathroom door, dripping water onto the rug. She didn't avert her eyes. She met his stare. The paralyzing fear she had carried for months was gone, burned away by the sheer, brutal reality of what she had just done. "Sit," Declan said, gesturing to a leather armchair opposite the bed. Sadie walked over and sat down. The leather was cold against her bare legs. Declan taped the gauze down. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his hands clasped together. He studied her. He looked at the dark circles under her eyes, the wet, tangled mess of her hair, the total absence of the arrogant spark she used to carry. "The man you killed," Declan started, his voice a low baritone in the quiet room. "He was a soldier for the Moretti family. They breached the outer gate by buying off one of the guards." "I didn't kill him," Sadie said. Her voice was raspy, exhausted. "You shot him." "You severed his carotid artery with a pair of dressmaker's shears," Declan corrected her, leaning back. "He was dead the second you swung. The bullet just sped up the clock." Sadie swallowed hard. She expected to feel a wave of nausea, but she just felt numb. "Why did you do it?" Declan asked. His eyes narrowed, searching her face. "You could have stayed in the closet. The men would have swept the room and moved on. You had no obligation to her." "I didn't do it for her," Sadie said, the words slipping out honestly. She didn't try to dress it up. She didn't try to play the martyr. "I did it because I was tired of being a ghost. I was tired of being dead." Declan held her gaze. For the first time in 6 months, he really looked at her. The mechanics of his expression shifted. The hollow void was gone. It was replaced by a grim, heavy recognition. "You burned down my house on our wedding night," Declan said softly. "You took a match to the respect this family relies on to survive." "I know," Sadie said. She didn't apologize. Apologies were for civilians. "Tonight," Declan continued, his voice steady, "you paid the toll. You bled for the house." He stood up. He walked over to a heavy oak dresser, opened the top drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. He walked back to Sadie and tossed it onto her lap. Sadie looked at the box. She slowly opened it. Inside rested a heavy, platinum signet ring, stamped with the Gallagher family crest. It wasn't a wedding band. It wasn't a diamond. It was the ring worn by capos, by blood, by people who were inside the circle. Sadie looked up at him. Her chest tightened, a strange, complicated knot of relief and profound sorrow settling in her ribs. "Put it on," Declan said. She took the heavy metal ring out of the box and slid it onto her right index finger. It was cold and heavy. It fit perfectly. Declan looked at the ring on her hand. He didn't smile. He didn't reach out to touch her. The romantic love that had blinded them both before the wedding was dead and buried, a casualty of her arrogance and his brutal world. What replaced it was something darker, heavier, and infinitely more durable. It was an alliance. "You are the lady of the house, Sadie," Declan said, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying finality. "Tomorrow, you will sit at the head of the table. You will learn the books. You will learn the roots. And you will never, ever be glass again." Sadie looked down at her hands. The blood was gone, washed down the drain, but her skin still felt stained. She closed her hand into a fist, feeling the cold bite of the platinum signet ring against her knuckles. "No," Sadie whispered into the quiet, bleach-scented room. "I won't." Did Sadie's brutal awakening and raw survival keep you glued to the screen? The world of the Gallagher family is unforgiving, and the line between steel and glass is razor thin. If you want to dive deeper into more dark, grounded audio dramas and mafia stories that pull no punches, hit that like button right now. Share this video with a friend who loves a cynical, gritty narrative, and make sure to subscribe to the channel with notifications on so you never miss our next descent into the shadows. Drop a comment below. Did Sadie earn her redemption?